Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the concluding class that we began 2.5 years ago on the Abrahamic religions leading up to the Baha'i Faith, and which really is the short history of the world religions, at least the last part of it. Of the sequence of cycles, the Abrahamic cycle followed by the Baha'i cycle. And want you to, hold on just a minute, let me go to this, to realize that what we're going to do tonight is going to be sort of a happy ending to a story that we began with the Jewish religion and the concept of religion and history, how a history of humankind on our planet, on any planet where there's a human society, that all of them are destined to have a happy ending, because the evolution of human society is the plan of God. And while we resist it or ignore it or don't appreciate it, we are living in an era of transition, as we've said for the last many meetings, from a time of ignoring the advice of the manifestations to the point, as we said in the last meeting, where when the lesser peace comes, we will have no choice but to accede to the logic implicit in the plan of Baha'u'llah, that logic being the establishment of a world commonwealth of nations. And as we noticed, or not noticed, but as we studied last time, it will begin with two parallel systems, the Baha'i Faith evolving all over the world, structuring a foundation for a world society, as the lesser peace proceeds with the establishment of a secular federation. And as we're going to start off tonight, sort of rehearsing one or two slides from that, we're going to get just a glimpse of, so what happens once the golden age becomes? What, and of course, it'll evolve too through processes. And as we said last time, all the dispensations that will follow in the Baha'i era of 500,000 years, and that's only one cycle, there'll be cycles after that. What kinds of unity and refinement will occur, we can only imagine. Will there be, for example, unity with other planets and so forth? Well, the Guardian hinted in one statement that there probably would be. So the talk tonight, Envisioning the World Order of Baha'u'llah, is going to give us a glimpse of the transition from the lesser peace to the world order, and Shoghi Effendi's very explicit description of what is distinguishing about the world order Baha'u'llah as a governing, as a form of government. So rather than let me describe what he says, let's just go ahead and see what he says about it. Then we're going to end up going over the, just scanning the laws of the Agdas, which I'm sure all of you have probably looked at in the outline, but I put that outline on slides for you in case, just so you would be able to just sort of glance at, well, it's going to have this and not that and so forth. And then we'll talk about some of them in the Q&A. So envisioning the world order of Baha'u'llah, and this is a slide we had in the last class, this final and crowning stage in the evolution of the plan wrought by God himself for humanity. will in turn prove to be the signal for the birth of a world civilization, incomparable in its range, its character and potency in the history of mankind. A civilization which posterity will with one voice acclaim as the fairest fruit of the golden age of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, and whose rich harvest will be garnered during future dispensations destined to succeed one another in the course of the 5,000 century Baha'i cycle. And we read that, of course, last time. That's very general. But what are the essential ingredients of this Baha'i Commonwealth of the future? The Baha'i Commonwealth of the future, of which this vast administrative order is the sole framework. So if you want to know what is the basic outline or framework for what that future Commonwealth is going to be, not the lesser piece, not the secular Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth once the golden age has come, is both in theory and practice not only unique in the entire history of political institutions, but can find no parallel in the annals of any of the world's recognized religious systems. No form of democratic government, no system of autocracy or a dictatorship, for the monarchical or republican, no intermediary scheme of a purely aristocratic order, or even any of the recognized types of theocracy, whether it be the Hebrew Commonwealth, or the various Christian ecclesiastical organizations, or the Emanate, or the Caliphate in Islam. None of these can be identified or said to be conform with the administrative order which the master hand of its perfect architect has fashioned. So what Baha'u'llah has done in the world order that he has designed and which we are practicing now. So this, as Shoghi Effendi said in the previous slide, the closest thing to this is the present day administrative order. He says, of which this vast administrative order is the sole framework. This newborn administrative order incorporates within its structure certain elements which are to be found in each of the three recognized forms of secular government, without being in any sense a mere replica of any one of them, and without introducing within its machinery any of the objectionable features which they inherently possess. It blends and harmonizes as no government fashioned by mortal hands has yet accomplished the salutary truths which each of these systems undoubtedly contains, without vitiating the integrity of those God-given verities on which it is ultimately founded. So it takes the best parts of each of those three forms of government, and indeed some other forms as well, without being exactly like them, and without having any of the derogatory or objectionable, as he says, aspects of those governments. The administrative order of the faith of Baha'u'llah must in no wise be regarded as purely democratic. So there's democracy, that's your first form of government, which it is like unto in some respects. We elect our representatives who in turn elect the administrative order and so forth. In character, inasmuch as the basic assumption which requires all democracies to depend fundamentally upon getting their mandate from the people is altogether lacking in this dispensation. So in other words, the mandate is not from the people elect the executive bodies, and the executive bodies are not responsible to those whom elect them. In the conduct of the administrative affairs of the faith, and the enactment of the legislation necessary to supplement the laws of the Kitabi Agdas, the members of the Universal House of Justice, it should be borne in mind, are not, as Baha'u'llah's utterances clearly imply, responsible to those whom they represent, nor are they allowed to be governed by the feelings, the general opinion, and even the convictions of the mass of the faithful, or of even those who directly elect them. They are to follow in a prayerful attitude the dictates and promptings of their conscience. And freed from all error, remember that, So the conclusions they come to may not be to our liking. So they're not responsible to make us feel happy about their decisions, but to do what is best for us, even if we don't see it at the time. And this is something we discussed in the past when we were talking about the inception of the sequence of 5-year plans, where many people thought that there was a sort of conflict between the local assemblies or the administrative order and the teaching agencies. And of course, this was confusion that was understandable, but we finally now, I think, understand the distinction between the teaching plans and the teaching agencies and the executive agencies. They must acquaint themselves with the conditions prevailing among the community, must weigh dispassionately in their minds the merits of any case presented for their consideration, but must reserve for themselves the right of an unfettered decision. God will verily inspire them with whatsoever he willeth, is Baha'u'llah's incontrovertible assurance. They, and not the body of those who either directly or indirectly elect them, and of course, remember, the LSAs are directly elected, the NSAs are indirectly elected, and the House of Justice is directly elected by the NSAs, by their electorate, have thus been made the recipients of the divine guidance, which is at once the lifeblood and ultimate safeguard of this revelation. Moreover, he, the guardian, who symbolizes the hereditary principle in this dispensation, has been made the interpreter of the words of its author, and ceases consequently, by virtue of the actual authority vested in him, to be the figurehead invariably associated with the prevailing systems of constitutional monarchies. So there is the second form of government. So we've gone over a democracy, and remember he said there are the 3 predominant forms of government. So it has aspects of the democracy, it has aspects, though really of a republic there, it has aspects of a monarchy and the hereditary principle represented by the guardian and his authority. And finally, a theocracy. And I misspelled that too. I'll have to fix that. Nor can the Baha'i administrative order be dismissed as a hard and rigid system of unmitigated autocracy, or as an idle imitation of any form of absolutistic ecclesiastical government or theocracy, whether it be the papacy, the imamate, or any other similar institution, for the obvious reason that upon the international elected representatives of the followers of Baha'u'llah has been confirmed the exclusive right of legislating on matters not expressly revealed in the Baha'i writings. Neither the guardian of the faith nor any institution apart from the International House of Justice, and he means the Universal House of Justice, he uses both terms interchangeably, can ever usurp this vital and essential power or encroach upon that sacred right. The abolition of professional priesthood, with its accompanying sacraments of baptism, of communion, and of confession of sins, the laws requiring the election by universal suffrage of all local, national, and international houses of justice, the total absence of episcopal authority with its attendant privileges, corruptions, and bureaucratic tendencies are further evidence of the non-autocratic character of the Baha'i administrative order and of its inclination to democratic methods in the administration of its affairs. And that was a mouthful, and of course you'll need to read this over on your own more slowly, and you'll need to have theocracy spelled correctly. But the distinctions he's making here are, of course, extremely important insofar as not having a class of a clerical class or a class of divines that have any authority other than, so each Baha'i has as much authority as any other Baha'i. And that is other than the guardian. And of course, the guardian as an individual is deceased, though the guardianship remains in full force, think of this as very important. No individual in the Baha'i Faith has more authority than any other individual. They may serve on institutions that have authority. Now, I should say, of course, that the appointed counselors and auxiliary board members have authority, but it is an authority to assist, to help individuals or to help the institutions. The counselors help the NSAs, the auxiliary boards, the LSAs. So their authority is really one of assistance, and their function primarily, of course, like the hands of the cause, to teach the cause and to protect the cause. Nor is this order identified with the name of Baha'u'llah to be confused with any system of purely aristocratic government, in view of the fact that it upholds, on the one hand, the hereditary principle and entrusts the guardian of the faith with the obligation of interpreting its teachings, and provides, on the other hand, for the free and direct election from among the mass of the faithful of the body that constitutes its highest legislative organ. So aristocracy, of course, literally means ruling of the best, but in an aristocratic republic, you have a certain class of people who are designated to be the electors or the administrators. Whereas this administrative order cannot be said to have molded after any one of these recognized systems of government, it nevertheless embodies, reconciles, and assimilates within its framework such wholesome elements as are to be found in each of them. Now, he's already said that, but now he's going to list what those wholesome aspects of those three different forms, really fourth if you count the aristocracy of government. The hereditary authority which the guardian is called upon to exercise, the vital and essential functions which the universal house discharges, the specific provisions requiring its democratic election by the representatives of the faithful, these combine to demonstrate the truth that this divinely revealed order, which can never be identified with any of the standard types of government referred to by Aristotle in his works, embodies and blends with the spiritual verities on which it is based, the beneficent elements which are to be found in each one of them. The admitted evils inherent in each of these systems being rigidly and permanently excluded, this unique order, however long it may endure and however extensive its ramifications, cannot ever degenerate into any form of despotism, of oligarchy, or of demagogy, which must sooner or later corrupt the machinery of all man-made and essentially defective political institutions. So this is not saying if we do the right thing or so on. It's saying it is secure. And this, again, is where the study of the covenant is so important, because that is, the covenant is the organ, if you will, from which this assurance derives, that it will never degenerate. But of course, it will never degenerate into these forms or the flaws inherent in those systems, because it's an ingeniously devised system. That is, not just because it is of God, but because God is logical, and God has created a logically self-sufficient system. So the prospect for the future of the Baha'i world. It is not our purpose here to delineate all the duties and procedures presently employed in the Baha'i administrative order. No doubt many of these will change and evolve to befit the needs of what will increasingly become the secular affairs of a religious community. Now, remember I said there are two systems, right? There's the evolution, we talked about this at length last class. You've got the secular evolving whenever the lesser piece comes around, and it will come about out of necessity, sheer necessity. But it will be secular. It will not be caused by the Baha'i Faith, though, as we also read last time, the extent to which the Baha'i faith spreads and is infused into the minds and hearts of the populace of the world will mitigate the difficulties that humankind will have to go through to realize that a global commonwealth is the solution to global crises, whether it be a pandemic, whether it be the need for the whole world to have essential, foundational, inalienable possession of education, shelter, food, clothing, etc. So it evolves collaterally. That is, as the Baha'i faith is evolving, and we will, in other words, on the one hand, we finished evolving administratively with that House of Justice election in 1963, but the sophistication coming down from that body and improving the operation of the local assemblies and secondary houses of justice or national assemblies will evolve. And then, of course, they will then become, well, he says this later, so let me wait till we get to that. They will become more executive bodies doing governmental work within the community than strictly confined to religious affairs. So collaterally, these two systems, the Baha'i faith and the secular government, are the lesser piece, with a global federal system increasingly in need of sane and effective guidance in all its most mundane affairs and concerns. But we do know a few important noteworthy certainties. So here we go with a few of them. First, we know that the elected councils, and this is what I was about to narrate for you, but instead we'll let the Guardian tell us in his own incredible articulation of this. First, we know that the elected councils of the Baha'i administrative order, the universal, the secondary, and the local, will continue to have legislative, executive, and judicial powers over the Baha'i community. And of course, they will become known as local houses of justice, secondary houses of justice, and the universal house of justice. And instead of being national assemblies, they will designate, sort of like we've done with the cluster, I imagine in time, rather than be bound by the reason we use national assemblies, and that is, why don't we just designate what territories we wish? Well, we've done that with the cluster, but because we want to be in collusion with and in sync with local law, so that's why you have an assembly must be within some jurisdictional boundary, whether it be a county or a city, so that the laws by which we are governed are in sync with the Baha'i law and so on. But also it's already an established and recognized boundary. Thus, the powers that on the world level will, during the lesser peace, become vested in the world parliament. And remember, we looked at these last time. These three really, the world parliament, the world executive, and the tribunal, but the fourth was the world policekeeping force. So these three bodies during the lesser peace will eventually become merged in the context of the Baha'i Commonwealth. So I said this last time, but it's so important to realize these two systems will become one system, and that the powers of the International Tribunal will become merged in the Universal House of Justice. Shoghi Effendi confirms this by observing that when the Baha'i state will be established, and the Baha'i state will be the world state, the International Tribunal, sometimes alluded to as the Universal Court of Arbitration, will be merged in the House of Justice. In this connection, Shoghi Effendi states that only when the emergence of the most great peace, the truth of the Baha'i revelation is embraced by the peoples of the world, will the Universal House of Justice attain the plenitude of its power and exercise as the supreme organ of the Baha'i Commonwealth all the rights, the duties, and the responsibilities incumbent upon the world's future super state. So in other words, the House of Justice, that's why I used the picture of the House of Justice in reminding everyone about this class tonight, because there you're looking at that physical edifice and the institution that occupies it as what will be the head of the future superstate, or the Baha'i world order, or the Golden Age, the government of the Golden Age. From this remarkable assertion, we must infer not only that the Universal House of Justice will function as the supreme organ of that future Commonwealth. And again, we're talking about the Commonwealth of the Golden Age, not the Commonwealth of the Lesser Peace, but also that the powers of the Universal House of Justice, as well as those of the other elective councils, will increase, not decrease. Because, in other words, they will assume responsibilities for the government of the local community. Therefore, when Abdul Baha states, and it reminds me at a long time ago when I was at a Florida Baha'i school, that I forget whether it was Sarah Pereira or Mag Carney said that, right now being on an LSA is difficult and hard, and we don't think much of it, and we may not even want to be elected to them. But in the future, when the history of our community is written out and studied, we will take such pride in the fact that we were part of the founding of that institution. That's how important the local community or the local House of Justice will become. Therefore, when Abdul Baha states that the House of Justice, whether national or universal, has only legislative power and not executive power, he's not delimiting the powers of that body. The Universal House of Justice itself notes, while ultimately the major function of the Universal House of Justice will be that of legislation, making the laws, and it has the authority to make laws that, as long as they don't contradict the laws that Baha'u'llah has made, it has the authority to implement those laws, decide when they should be implemented, and to make laws that Baha'u'llah did not make, but within the under the auspices of the laws that Baha'u'llah has made. And we're going to look at those at the very end of our session tonight. We're just going to comb through them and see, what would that society feel like? What will it look like? It has continuing responsibility for executive and judicial functions of the institution. In effect, Abdul Baha seems to be indicating the general distinction between the twin duties of knowing and doing. So this is an often discussed passage here: legislative power, not executive power. I won't go into it in detail, but suffice it to say that there was some controversy about 20 years ago or so on about the fact that whether or not the House of Justice was free from error in all its decisions or only in its legislative decisions. This came out of a book that was widely spread in, it was a Baha'i book and a very well-written book by Udo Schaefer. And in this book, he implies that the House of Justice is only infallible in those legislative decisions it makes. So, but if you look, as we have in this course, at the will and testament of Abdul Baha, he does not say that. He says, in everything they decide, they are free from error. So that means, in one hand, of course, you'd have a hard time deciding, well, what is a legislative decision versus a non-legislative decision? Well, you kind of can make that distinction in some ways. I guess you can say that, well, let me not we can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested. In effect, Abdu'l-Baha seems to be indicated the difference between knowing and doing, and the fact that the Universal House of Justice may legislate and give guidance, but the execution of this guidance is left to the world community. And this is the crux of this thing right here. And ultimately to the individuals that comprise that community. In other words, you can give guidance, but as I've said before, when we were talking about the 4 or 5 year teaching plans and now the 8-year teaching plan, you can't mandate change at the grassroots level. It has to emanate from motivated individuals at the grassroots. And that's exactly what's being said here. The House of Justice can give guidance in its executive decisions, but it's up to us to follow them. The Universal House of Justice, by right of the authority vested in it, functions like the head in relation to the rest of the body. It may determine the best course of action, but the execution of that task must be carried out by the body politic as a whole, a condition that already obtains. Now, what does that mean? It means the fact that even though the House of Justice doesn't have authority over the secular community, insofar as the Baha'i community is concerned, it gives guidance that is infallible according to the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, but is up to us whether or not we follow it or not, or how enthusiastically we follow it, or with what attitude we follow it. And of course, that's true with all the laws that we are presently incumbent upon us as Baha'is, the laws of Baha'u'llah. Since the local and national assemblies will function in a fashion somewhat parallel to that of the Universal House of Justice, in other words, they will function in the same way the House of Justice does, by legislating, we might well presume that these same inferences would be applicable to the future responsibilities of these institutions when they become local or secondary houses of justice. In other words, we're not at that point yet. But when they do, they will have this authority. Shoghi Effendi seems to confirm this inference when he says, not only will the present-day spiritual assemblies be styled differently in the future, that is, they will be houses of justice, but they will be, and again, not national, but secondary, which means it could be a territory or it could be an island and so on. But they will be enabled also to add to their present functions those powers, duties, and prerogatives necessitated by the recognition of the faith of Baha'u'llah. In this context, we come to appreciate more fully the collaborative effort implicit and explicit in the hierarchical relationship among the 3 levels of administrative institutions, the local, the secondary, and the international, as well as between these institutions and the body of believers whose affairs and interests they serve. Quote, let us also bear in mind that the keynote of the cause of God is not dictatorial authority, but humble fellowship, not arbitrary power, but the spirit of frank and loving consultation. Isn't that beautiful? And this particular phrase was highly emphasized when the first of still in the second of those 5-year plans came out from 2001 to 2006 and from 2006 to 2011. This was a very important quote because in some cases, communities felt they were being oppressed by those who were trying to set up the core activities and so on. And so you had, again, as I mentioned before, you had this sense of conflict, which was really just a misunderstanding. between the powers and functions of the local assemblies and the powers and functions of the core activities and the cluster agencies. Now, here we get to, we're sort of focusing in now. Though it might seem that the system of the world commonwealth implied in the Baha'i model of governments is fundamentally hierarchical in structure, in reality, each administrative body is designed to have a maximum of autonomy and to operate as an organic entity. Here again, the analogy of a planetary system is useful. And he's going to give this, and we'll look at it, and you will, I think, find it a very useful analogy to what we're talking about. And that is, you have the hierarchical system of the House of Justice, then you have the secondary House of Justice and the local House of Justice. But each of those has autonomy to a certain extent, even though it has to follow the guidance of the institution above it. The local House of Justice obviously will be largely responsible for what it does in accordance with the needs and capacities of the believers in its community. So the needs and capacities of a community in an urban area are going to be quite different from the needs and capacities of someone in a remote village. So they have the autonomy to decide, well, what's best here? What's the best way to do what we need to do in this circumstance? So he compares this to the solar system. At the center of these institutions, functioning as the nucleus, are the twin aspects of the revelation, the spiritual guidance and the law. And again, we go back to the short obligatory prayer and the first sentence of the first paragraph of the Agdas. To know and to do, the spiritual guidance, the recognition of the manifestation, and obedience to his laws. And neither, remember that concluding passage in that first paragraph of the Agdas, neither is acceptable without the other. Circling around that center are the 9 members of the institution. By themselves, the members have no individual authority, administrative powers, or special status. Functioning together, they create organic vitality. Each system is thus organically related to successively more encompassing organisms, and these are arranged in the same fashion, much as in the Newtonian paradigm of cosmological order. Moons orbit planets that in turn orbit the sun, and the solar system in turn swirls about in the arms that extend out from the nucleus of our galaxy, which also rotates. I believe when we used that analogy many classes ago, we said we have, I think, 21 more times that the Earth will rotate in around the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, before it extinguishes. But at any rate, indeed, we can imagine that in the future evolution of human society, the intimate awareness of the Earth as one system would be expanded to incorporate a more inclusive sense of ourselves as part of an infinitely expandable expression of the divine will. This is such an incredible passage here. In other words, we can imagine that there are other planets going through what we're going through. We can imagine that we will have contact with those planets. We may assist them or they may assist us. But ultimately, whether we accomplish that during our lifetime, and it looks like that we will probably not, you become in your mind aware as you think of the expansion of this system, that it's not just this one planet, that it is a myriad of planets, that indeed, according to the writings, that the cosmos, the universe, is infinite in time, infinite in space, infinite in plenitude. And so you begin to get a sense of why God is incomprehensible to us, why we can understand his purpose, and how we can understand all the attributes of God. All right. But we can't understand or comprehend a being that could bring such an infinite thing into a system into being. A unique form of governance. The point is that even with the glimpse of our immediate future that the present Baha'i model of governance provides, we can begin to discover the traits that distinguish the system revealed by Baha'u'llah from other systems with which we may be familiar. In a general assessment of such a comparison, Shoghi Effendi states that this newborn administrative order incorporates within its structure certain elements which are to be found in each of the three recognized forms. Now, this is, of course, a repeating of a paragraph we read earlier, but it's worth repeating. The forms of secular government, without being in any sense a mere replica of any one of them, and without introducing within its machinery any of the objectionable features which they inherently possess. It blends and harmonizes as no government fashioned by mortal hands has yet accomplished the salutary truths which each of these systems undoubtedly contains, without vitiating the integrity of those God-given verities on which it is ultimately founded. To demonstrate this truth, the truth of this assertion, Shoghi Effendi compares some of the similarities between the Baha'i model and other paradigms. And of course, we've already gone through that. So what will it look like? Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Just 1 second. Here. The result of what will be the result of the implementation of the world order Baha'u'llah. And so here you have, since the theme of our class tonight is getting a vision, just a sense of what will it be like when it finally does arrive. National rivalries, hatreds, and intrigues will cease, and racial animosity and prejudice will be replaced by racial amity, understanding and cooperation. The causes of religious strife will be permanently removed. Economic barriers and restrictions will be completely abolished, and the inordinate distinction between classes will be obliterated. Destitution on the one hand and gross accumulation of ownership on the other will disappear. The enormous energy dissipated and wasted on war, whether economic or political, will be consecrated to such ends as will extend the range of human inventions and technical development to the increase of the productivity of mankind, to the extermination of disease, to the extension of scientific research, to the raising of the standard of physical health, to the sharpening and refinement of the human brain, to the exploitation of the unused and unsuspected resources of the planet, to the prolongation of human life, and to the furtherance of any other agency that can stimulate the intellectual, the moral, and spiritual life of the entire human race. That paragraph alone should inspire you and fill you with wonder. It is just amazing. There's one sentence where we talk about the racial animosity and prejudice will be replaced by racial amity. Not only that, but it is my understanding, and it's totally my understanding, I know it's true, but Abdul Baha talks about we will become one race. I think that's to be might well be meant literally, that as we intermarry and so on. I mean, of course, it's already happening in some areas, but that we really will become so blended that we will be effectively one race. But of course, it's talking about a spiritual sense too. A world federal system ruling the whole earth and exercising unchallengeable authority over its unimaginably vast resources, blending and embodying the ideals of both the East and the West, liberated from the curse of war and its miseries, and bent on the exploitation of all the available sources of energy on the surface of the planet, a system in which force is made the servant of justice, whose life is sustained by its universal recognition of one God and by its allegiance to one common revelation. Such is the goal towards which humanity, impelled by the unifying forces of life, is moving. And finally, the Baha'i community life provides you, and this is a return. So we've looked at the most expansive vision, but it all comes back to the community. And that's why I put this here, is that ultimately you think globally, you think, perhaps you think planetarily, but you live locally. That's where life takes place. The Baha'i community life provides you with an indispensable laboratory where you can translate into living and constructive action the principles which you imbibe from the teachings. By becoming a real part of that living organism, you can catch the real spirit which runs through the Baha'i teachings. To study the principles and to try to live according to them are, therefore, the two essential mediums through which you can ensure the development and progress of your inner spiritual life and of your outer existence as well. So I'm going to finish with this. We're going to go through this quickly because this is just, you've all seen this. But as you know, the most holy book is divided into laws, ordinances, and exhortations. And of course, it has, as we've just studied this many classes ago in detail for many classes, the Kitabi Agdas. But at the heart of the listing of the laws, as opposed to the notes and to the commentaries and introductions and so forth, it's divided into laws, ordinances, and exhortations. So they're basically, there are 4 or 5 categories. There's prayers and all of the information about prayers and guidance. There's guidance about fasting, guidance about laws of personal status. This would be marriage and becoming a Baha'i and so on. Marriage, divorce, inheritance. Then miscellaneous laws, ordinances, and exhortations. And this is what we're going to end on, because I want you to just look at them and take note of any of them, because we're not going to discuss all of them and it would take too long. There are 3 pages here. We're going to click through real quickly. But any that you want to talk about in the Q&A that you just have thoughts about, it doesn't have to be official, but just imagining, well, how would that be implemented? And what do you think that means? And of course, we don't know in some cases. So miscellaneous, under miscellaneous laws, we begin with miscellaneous laws and ordinances, pilgrimage, huquq, endowments, the Mashriq al-Azkar and its dependencies, the duration of the Baha'i dispensation, Baha'i festivals and holy days, the 19-day feasts, the Baha'i year, the intercalary days, the age of maturity, the burial of the dead. Engaging in a trade or profession is made obligatory and exalted to the rank of worship. Notice that many people say, a profession done in the attitude of service. Your service is that you're providing for yourself and for your family. And so it's to the rank of worship, whether it's as explicit service implications or not. Obedience to government, education of children, the writing of a testament. These are obligatory. Tithe, zakat. This is, as the note, again, some of these you have to go to the notes to even understand what it means. And this is talking about contribution to the funds, repetition of the greatest name, the hunting of animals. And of course, the law about that is interesting, that the hunting of animals is forbidden unless you need to do so for food. So it's not forbidden, but it's forbidden unless you're forbidden as a sport. Treatment of female servants, finding lost property, disposition of a treasure trove. Of course, a lot of these have a lot of notes. Disposal of objects held in trust, manslaughter, definition of just witnesses, prohibitions. Okay, under prohibitions, we have interpretation of the Holy Writ. Now, that means authoritative. Everyone is encouraged. Some people read this and think they're not supposed to interpret the writings. No, you are exhorted to interpret the writings, to read them, studying, figure out what you think they mean. It means you don't, that there's no one who can have authoritative interpretation. Slave trading, asceticism. Now notice this, he's got asceticism, monasticism also distinguishes between the two, in case there's any confusion. Mendicancy, which of course is a form of asceticism, or can be, with the Darvish, who were mendicants, many of them, had their begging bowls and so on. Priesthood, forbidden. Use of pulpits, forbidden. The kissing of hands, confession of sins. Now, this doesn't mean you can't, of course, well, the notes, let me not go into detail. Suffice to say, doesn't mean you can't tell a friend or someone who's counseling you something you've done. It's talking about it is not required, and that this is not some way there's no formal way of doing this. And there follows a prayer that you can say. Plurality of wives, forbidden. Intoxicating drinks, opium, which is interpreted to mean any drug that has a similar effect. Gambling, arson, adultery, murder, theft, homosexuality, congregational prayer except for the dead. Now, that doesn't mean you can't say prayers together. You can. So read the note on that one, because it's interesting. I always thought it meant you couldn't collectively say a prayer. You can do that, though I've never heard it done much in the faith. Cruelty to animals, idleness and sloth, backbiting, calumny, lying about others, carrying arms unless essential, use of public pools and Persian baths, entering a house without the owner's permission, striking or wounding a person. So I guess the martial arts will become a thing of the past. Contention and conflict, muttering sacred verses in the streets. Now, some of these are responding to specific activities that are done in certain cultures. So some of them don't mean anything to us in a Western culture, but they would mean something to someone in an Eastern culture and so on. So this is well, I mean, I get into that. Plunging one's hand in food. Of course, that's a Middle Eastern tradition. Shaving one's head. What does that mean? Does that mean, because that's quite a fashion now? I don't know. It's not been implemented. Growth of men's hair beyond the lobe of the ear. Well, most people interpret that to mean the forelocks. So again, it's maybe referring to a cultural thing. We don't know yet. I remember when I was on pilgrimage, and Ian Simple said, he gave that as an example of the House of Justice will have to elucidate that and to figure out what it means. So then we go to another category, abrogation of specific laws and ordinances of previous dispensations, which prescribed destruction of books. So in other words, these prescribed, not proscribed. So these were mandated in some cultures and some dispensations. The prohibition of wearing silk is, in other words, that's not a problem anymore. In other words, that's abrogation of that prohibition. Prohibition of using gold and silver utensils, limitation of travel, offering of priceless gifts to the founder of the faith, prohibition on questioning the founder of the faith. We're encouraged to ask questions. Prohibition against remarrying one's divorced wife. penalizing whosoever causes sadness to his neighbor. I believe that's a Jewish law or tradition. Prohibition of music, limitations upon one's apparel and beard, uncleanliness of diverse objects and peoples, uncleanliness of semen, uncleanliness of certain objects for purposes of prostration, and then miscellaneous exhortations to associate with the followers of all religions with fellowship, to honor one's parents. These are we are exhorted to do now. Not to wish for others what you do not wish for yourself, the golden rule. To teach and propagate. Of course, it's a step further than the golden rule. The golden rule says, don't do unto others. And this says, don't even think about doing for someone else what you would not want happen to yourself. To teach and propagate the faith after the ascension of the founder. To assist those who arise to promote the faith. Not to depart from the writings or to be misled by those who do. To refer to the Holy Writ when differences arise. To immerse oneself in the study of the teaching. Not to follow one's idle fancies and vain imaginings. To recite the holy verses at morn and at eventide. Now notice this is different from prayers, or could be considered as such. Recite the holy verses. It could be the prayers. So let me not say, obviously this would be up to the House of Justice to say if there's some distinction. To recite the holy verses melodiously. To teach one's children to chant the holy verses in the Mashriq al-Azkar. To study such arts and sciences as benefit mankind. To take counsel together. Not to be indulgent in carrying out the statutes of God. To repent to God of one's sins. To distinguish oneself through good deeds. To be truthful, to be trustworthy, to be faithful. To be righteous and fear God, to be just and fair, to be tactful and wise, to be courteous, to be hospitable, to be persevering, to be detached, to be absolutely submissive to the will of God, not to stir up mischief, not to be hypocritical, not to be proud, not to be fanatical, not to prefer oneself to one's neighbor, not to contend with one's neighbor, not to indulge in one's passions, not to lament in adversity, not to contend with those in authority, not to lose one's temper, not to anger one's neighbor, to be closely united, to consult competent physicians when ill, to respond to invitations. Isn't that interesting? Something so specific. That's always interested me and also challenged me. To show kindness to the kindred of the founder of the faith, to study languages for the furtherance of the faith, to further development of cities and countries for the glorification of the faith, to restore and preserve the sites associated with the founders of the faith, to be the essence of cleanliness. And here's the particular things: to wash your feet, to perfume oneself, to bathe in clean water, to cut one's nails, to wash soiled things in clean water, to be stainless in one's dress, to renew the furnishing of one's house. And that's it. And of course, the refurnishing, there are all kinds of notes on these. It's supposed to be every 19 years, but then what if you've got precious furniture and so on? It's specified, it clears that up. So, my dear friends, there's a happy ending ahead for us and for the whole of humanity on planet Earth. And that's a happy ending to our course as well. There is the Qibla, and that's the end of our class, and that's the end of our course, which took 2.5 years, but it's been fun. Next week, same time, we will begin a whole new series of firesides. We'll start numbering them. And the first fireside will be on the purpose of physical reality.